This is NTD Newsroom, live from our global headquarters in New York City.
Thank you for staying with us. President Trump in the Oval Office announcing that Pfizer will heavily discount their medications for Americans. We now go live to NTD's Washington correspondent, Mari Otsu, who's at the White House. Good afternoon, Mari. What is the latest from the president's Oval Office announcement today?
Don, good afternoon. Yes, just moments ago, President Trump today in the Oval Office is announcing that Pfizer will provide some of their most popular medications at heavily discounted prices for Americans, which means up to between 50 and 100% off. And that any new medications introduced into the U.S. market will be sold at the reduced most favored nation cost. This means that Pfizer will match American drug prices to the lowest drug price paid by any other developed nations. President Trump also says these drugs will be available on a federal website called trumprx.gov, which the administration hopes will launch in early 2026. The president also had this to say about Medicaid. Watch.
Today, Pfizer is committing to offer all of their prescription medications to Medicaid, and it will be at the most favored nation's prices. It's going to have a huge impact on bringing Medicaid costs down like nothing else.
Today's announcement comes after President Trump in May signed an executive order directing drug makers to start offering U.S. patients the most favored nation pricing for their medicines. However, unhappy with the progress made by July, President Trump then sent 17 letters to CEOs of major pharmaceutical companies demanding that they lower drug prices to match those paid by other wealthy nations by September 29th, which was yesterday. And now today, Pfizer is responding to that demand. Here's FDA Commissioner Marty Makary and HHS Secretary RFK Jr. on today's announcement. Watch.
And today marks the beginning of the end of the Great American Ripoff. And it also marks the beginning and the end of a great American tragedy, something I've seen as a physician at the bedside.
We refuse to make the most vulnerable citizens continue to pay an unthinkable price for the world's pharmaceutical breakthroughs, which we pay for. No family should ever be forced to choose between filling a prescription and putting food on the table. Americans should not be gouged paying 300 or 400 or 1,000% more than people in other countries for the exact same drug.
Pfizer is also announcing a $70 billion investment in American pharmaceutical research and to reshore domestic manufacturing facilities. Pfizer will be given a 3-year grace period exempt from President Trump's pharmaceutical tariffs as long as they move all of their production to the U.S. Don, back to you.
Okay, Mari, thank you. Congressional Democrats are not backing down on their health care and budget demands, raising the possibility of a government shutdown at midnight. NTD's Melina Weisskopf has the details.
Democrats continue to demand Republicans to include in the short-term funding bill a provision to extend Obamacare tax subsidies. They say this is the only way Republicans will get their votes to keep the government open. Listen.
We have very large differences on health care and on their ability to undo whatever budget we agree to through rescissions and through impoundment.
So what Schumer is trying to do here is essentially to use this shutdown as leverage to get assurances from Republicans that whatever budget they agree to for next year, Republicans won't then try to undermine later by using more pocket rescissions packages to go back and cut from that agreed upon 2026 budget. Now remember, the Republican-controlled House already passed a short-term extension of government funding to keep the lights on through November, but it failed in the Senate because of lack of Democrat support. So Republicans say there's nothing to negotiate on their bill because it's simply meant to extend the government funding levels that both Democrats and Republicans already agreed to last year. Basically, the White House meeting did nothing to prevent the possibility of a shutdown.
If they want to talk about how to fix American health care policy, let's do it. The Speaker would love to do it. The Senate Majority Leader would love to do it. Let's work on it together. But let's do it in the context of an open government that's providing essential services to the American people. That's all that we're proposing to do. And the fact that they refuse to do that shows how unreasonable their position is. I think we're headed to a shutdown.
So what happens if the federal government shuts down? It's actually a partial shutdown where some essential services are kept. Mail service will continue to run. Social security checks will still go out. Essential workers like FBI investigators, CIA officials, among others, will stay on duty, though those who are still going to work while the government shut down won't get paid until Congress acts. But then those who are furloughed during the shutdown will get back pay for the time that they were out. Though a government shutdown this time will have more consequences than previous ones. That's because the Trump administration directed agencies to use this opportunity to get a better understanding of how they can reduce the federal workforce permanently to further the administration's plans of slashing the overall size of the federal workforce. Trump this morning was asked how many federal workers he plans to lay off. Here's what he said.
Well, we may do a lot, and that's only because of the Democrats. And as you know, they wanted to be able to take care of people that have come into our country illegally, and no system can handle that.
But for the time being, Republicans are pinning their hopes on the fact that Democrats might cave and let go of their demands like they did back in March. Reporting from Washington, D.C., Melina Weisskopf, NTD News.
A potential government shutdown could be just hours away as Republicans and Democrats remain at odds over a proposed stopgap spending bill. Joining us now to discuss is Mike Leon, NTD News contributor and host of the Can We Please Talk podcast. And we have Tony Kinnett, national correspondent at the Daily Signal and host of the Tony Kinnett Cast radio show and podcast. First of all, good afternoon to you both. Mike, I'll start with you today. How much of this, is about substantive issues, and how much about is it trying to make the other side look like they're to blame?
That's a great first question. First off, good to see you all. Let me see, percentage-wise, I think it's probably a 50-50 line. I was watching Speaker Thune today on C-SPAN earlier, and Chuck Schumer, both giving their different speeches and talking about the different times that there's been government shutdowns, and Thune was talking about the different times that Democrats have all voted on the same side, obviously blaming them now because they need the 8 votes to get this to pass. And then in turn, you hear Schumer talking about that, they've called the offices different times to try to meet throughout this entire period, and that this is all Republicans' fault. So again, and Thune said this in his speech, so I don't want to steal his thunder. He said, this is what politics is, right? This is what the word politics was invented. I'm paraphrasing a little bit. So I think a lot of it is performative. The substantive part, maybe I'll change my percentage here, Don, and make it a little 60-40, because I think that the actual substantive part in terms of the ACA credits and these expiring before midnight are things that do impact millions of Americans starting later today at 12 midnight. And then there's also the fact that there's going to be government employees, like Melina just mentioned, that are going to be furloughed, that ones that are going to have to work for free while the shutdown happens. The last time we had a shutdown that lasted about 35 days was between the 2018-2019 period. Nobody wants to go to work and work for free, Don. Nobody wants to get back pay, a month or so later. So this is really coming up against the 24th hour here. And we truly need something to come to fruition over these next couple of hours.
So, Tony, what do you think? How much of this is about the issues at hand?
Well, I think that the issue at hand is really about the direction of both parties. And I think that I agree with Mike, of course, because he and I very much agree on the performative part of politics and then versus the policy side. In this case, though, I find them linked. And the reason I say that is because right now the Democrat Party is searching desperately for a message before midterms. And so what you have is a bill that they already voted on, that they already agreed to. Again, the Trump administration through the executive office suggested pocket rescissions, and then the Supreme Court upheld that for the next 30 days, that being a week ago. So about 23 days now, let's say, remaining to go until Congress does anything regarding that. So what we have right now is a Democrat Senate who is trying to play tough. And Hakeem Jeffries, as you see on the B-roll on the screen to my right, also trying this kind of performative yelling, and it's just not working. There's no actual substantive message here. Again, when the RNC Twitter account, one of the right-wing kind of research and receipt accounts, can post you saying the exact opposite thing a year ago, it's not a good look. And again, as we get into the full midterm season, a 14-month stint in any administration, you have an entire party that's essentially built around finding a message and then refusing to do so. So I actually had a conversation with a Democrat representative this morning out of Indiana who's very frustrated because he feels right now the Democrats need to be looking for a message. Instead, they're whining about a bill they already agreed on a year ago. It just doesn't look good.
So, Mike, broadly speaking, do you think there's actually enough time for lawmakers to, debate, negotiate, and actually pass spending bills?
Yeah, I mean, that's the question. I just reached out to a Democratic lawmaker as well to come on the show later today because Speaker Johnson sent the House into recess for up until October 7th, if I'm not mistaken. That was one of the things that Schumer had mentioned on the floor there, on the Senate floor. So is there enough time? I mean, there's always enough time, Don, right? Like obviously we can find enough time to potentially get now, is there enough time to negotiate on the issue? Remember, they need 8 Democratic votes right now. They have 0. And right now it's what, 2:14 p.m. Eastern time. So if I had to be a betting man, if I was wagering this live bet right now on one of the betting applications, I would 100% hammer the bet to us have a government shutdown starting at midnight. I don't think that there is enough time, which is why, back to Tony's point, the House tried to pass this clean CR recently and give the extension of the 45 days so that way we can continue to debate these issues. But as Tony and I have talked about in this segment numerous times throughout our history doing this, those are just punts, right? That's just matriculate. That's just pushing it further down the trough and not really fully funding the government through the entirety of the session of Congress. So that's the problem with all of this right now, is that there is time, but there's not enough time, if you know what I mean.
Okay, Tony, I can't even tell you the number of times I had to report a government shutdown each year. I really don't want to report on it anymore. How do we avoid this?
So you've actually touched on the reason that this doesn't matter to Americans. I saw a Kamala Harris campaign staffer say, well, actually, 43% of the public believes that a shutdown is bad. 36% say it's the other party's fault. And I hate to tell you this, but more and more Americans just don't care. Because after the 432nd time we've come on the air to discuss, the recent stopgap measures, will Johnson get it through with a slim majority? Will the Senate hold out, or will Cory Booker stand and yell for another 18 hours? Americans have seen this before. They know how it's going to go. The Democrats are, in fact, going to cave, because if they don't, Russell Vought from the OMB is going to swing on through and say, you know what, a lot of these federal workers we don't need. And, when the executive branch is given additional authority through a shutdown, this has really cornered the Democrats into a lose-lose situation that, again, they did themselves. When the election in 2024 took place and Americans made it very clear they wanted parties to work together, they wanted Democrats to move to the right, not Republicans to move to the left. That was the mandate. The mandate was not for the left to move further to the left. We can pretend otherwise, but it is true. Moderate Democrats performed far better than those on the far, far, far to the left side of the aisle. And instead of coming to the table and negotiating, not making it easy for states like Illinois, Minnesota, California to take federal dollars for their own citizens and then use state money to then fund illegal immigrant healthcare needs, as the Chicago Tribune reported in 2019 and again in 2021. Well, it's just kind of awkward, yet an unfortunate truth and reality that when Democrats say, I'm not budging, give us the money, or we're going to shut the government down. Again, the Americans that do care, albeit fewer of them than ever before, they're not rallying behind Democrats. They're just browsing social media angrily. And unfortunately, slacktivism doesn't win votes.
Okay, Mike, can we get your response? Is there a way that we can actually avoid this issue at a structural level?
Yeah, I have to respond to some of that, but not in a bad way. I'm actually going to piggyback on something Tony said there. See, I would love to be in either camp right now because the blame game is very easy. So let me just tell you what I've spoken to a few of those moderate Democrats that Tony mentioned: Congressman Glenn Ivey, Congressman Seth Moulton, Congressman Pat Ryan. They're all in that similar moderate Democrat type mold. All of them have done town halls recently, and Congressman Glenn Ivey said on my show, he said that whenever I talk to constituents, they realize we don't have the numbers. Why is it that we don't have the numbers? Because this mandate that we've been talking about, that Tony even mentioned there, played out in the election, giving Republicans control of the House, the Senate, and the executive branch. So it's very easy for Democrats to just say, you control everything. What do you need us for? Now, on the flip side, the counter to that is math, as I just mentioned before. They need 60 votes to fund this. So they do need 8 Democrats. And as Stune did earlier today on C-SPAN in his speech, he brought out all the times that Democrats cited to fund the government over these last, I want to say it's 24, 36 months, whatever it was, on his whiteboard that he brought out there. And it was in the 98% to 100% of votes, meaning that they know how to keep the government open. They just don't want to do it this time. So it is very easy to play the blame game from the political angle. But to Tony's point, people don't care. Not only that, but they have short attention spans. They're not going to remember this. Now, Don, your broader question of how do we avoid this? Well, we avoid it because polling always shows us that we do want bipartisanship, but we never get it. Here's a perfect example of both of them needing to work together because 52 plus 8 is 60, and neither of them are willing to budge on certain things. And we saw it yesterday play out. Both of them went out there in respective conferences right there on the White House lawn to reporters and blamed the other side, as opposed to saying, hey, when are we going to meet again? Because we only got 27 hours. When are we going to do this? It's a perfect example of why people are so turned off to American politics, just because within that whole stanza, they met inside the Oval, and then they go out there each respectively and continue to blame the other side. When Tony said it and I said it, Americans do want both of these parties to start working together. That's why you get slim majorities every single time, whether it be in the House or the Senate.
Okay, Tony, please respond to any point you see fit that Mike said there. And also, I want your comments on, there's talk of the administration using the shutdown as an opportunity to carry out layoffs.
Oh, I mean, that was an obvious. Russ Vought is someone that I know. He's been looking forward to doing so, given the opportunity for quite a long time. The majority of the right believes there are a lot of federal bureaucratic agencies that simply staff too many people. And I say that knowing many of the individuals who, for example, in housing and urban development, people whose entire jobs were essentially to write essays on why using one style of Adobe brick is more water soluble than the next style of Adobe style brick. I'm sorry, you don't need a full-time government position to do that. And I do believe that there are a lot of things to cut in that area. That's something the right's kind of used as an axe to grind for a long time, and rightly so in a lot of ways. Now, that said, I'll piggyback off of Mike's final point there by saying one of the reasons we don't see a lot of calls for bipartisanship that turn into action bipartisanship is because, Mike, you know as well as I know that as soon as we get out of this particular shutdown crisis, the very next day, Schumer and Cory Booker and Mazie Hirono and the rest of the Democrats in the Senate, save one or two, are going to go to cameras and go, those bunch of fascist, MAGA, Nazi, blankety, blankety blanks, calling them a threat of the country that want to disappear people and take away women's rights and stick them in red robes and bonnets and all this other nonsense. And then all of a sudden it comes time for budget and reconciliation or continuing resolutions. And it's, okay, now I'm ready to work with you and things like that. Because we have started blending the performative edge of politics, like Ayanna Pressley screaming on network television, with the sensible voices inside committee, because we've blended those so closely in American politics, we are getting closer to a Canadian junior high cafeteria style parliament fight that is very uncooperative. And is the answer to that, what you and I suggest, which is, the can we please talk? Can we please find the common ground? Absolutely. But with the lack of common ground being pushed forward, especially in a lot of the current rhetoric in the climate, obviously we've talked about that at length ad nauseum, it's really harder to say, well, Americans may vote for this or want this on paper. They'll say, I want bipartisanship. But then if you ask them what that means or who needs to give up ground, the answer is never both sides need to give up ground. The answer is never, well, I want the left and the right to both come to the center and do something in the middle. It's very, very low. It's like 10% of people who answered yes on the first, and then that being the second question. And that's really disappointing and unfortunate and doesn't really spell positive, let's say, kumbaya vibes in the future.
Okay, Mike, you were talking about the blame game earlier. Will the messaging of this shutdown from either party, whether it's blame or anything else, sway public opinion in favor of either party? Any impact on the upcoming midterms?
No. I mean, Don,
he's correct.
I mean, they're both doing it. I mean, like, and back to Tony's point, right? The performative part. Tony, you left out a couple performers there, like a Nancy Mace and some of the other ones. I gotta, and this is the thing. I want the debate about the policy, right? We've come on here a bunch of times and talked about, just look at immigration, for example, right? I've mentioned this a bunch. There's a policy change. Before it was civil. Now it's being treated as criminal. Those are things that people don't understand because the devil's in the details and it's minutia stuff. But for Tony and I, we eat that type of stuff up. Then we can talk about it and debate it. Other people don't want to consume that. They want the performative part of this. They want the Nancy Mace going out there and telling you this is all Democrats' fault and to blame and stuff like that. And no admission and just going out there and doing that. And others on the left too. I'm not absolving them. So I don't want the performance element. And by the way, there's a great study being done about members of Congress that tend to go on television more versus ones that don't, and where they kind of rank and file in terms of their stature and their social presence versus ones that don't. It's a great study. I wish I knew I had it offhand of where it is. I don't know if the Pew Center did it or I forget who, but this is what we see now, where people are trying to lift themselves to the next job. You know, I just mentioned Congressman Seth Moulton a second ago. He's running for Senate. He's not even going to be a member of Congress. He's going to challenge a seat, you know, in the Senate. So why? Because he wants a better job, because he wants to raise his profile. So that performance element, unfortunately, it affects the American people because it affects his constituents that got him voted on. And, you know, all that door-to-door knocking and doing all that grassroots stuff, that tends to go out the window once you get into D.C. and realize, you know what, I need to be in front of the cameras and raise my stature a little bit more, and I'll do some grandiose posturing and things like that. Thomas Massie all of a sudden is a household name. Nobody knew who Thomas Massie was 3 years ago, except for that maybe that outburst with him and Jamal Bowman on the Capitol steps talking about gun control. You didn't know who Thomas Massie was. Now you know who he is because he's been on Theo Von's show and things like that. The performative element needs to leave this, and I think the American people see that. So I don't think any public polling will sway one way or the other. They'll blame both of them for this shutdown.
Okay, well, we're basically out of time today. Tony, if you have anything to add quickly.
Just that when you go to a hockey game, you don't really want to see the game. You want to see fights. That's what the American people want right now. It's unfortunate. And again, just like the big, beautiful bill meant nothing really to voters, this shutdown's not going to mean anything either. And that's really bad for the opposition party come midterm.
All right. I think we can end it there. Thank you both once again. Tony, Mike, pleasure.
Thanks, guys, as always.
And now, Senate Majority Leader John Thune is talking to the media on Capitol Hill. Let's take a listen.
Clear binary choice. They can choose to keep the government open by voting for a short-term, nonpartisan, clean continuing resolution, 24 pages long, or they can vote to shut the government down. That's what we're looking at. They, as you all know, have voted during the time they had the majority 13 different times, and when Biden was in the White House, on short-term continuing resolutions, 13 different times. And so it begs the question is what's changed? And I think what's changed is President Trump is in the White House. That's what this is about. This is politics. And there isn't any substantive reason why there ought to be a government shutdown. This is something that has been done routinely, as I said, 13 different times when the Democrats had the majority. But we are not going to be held hostage for over $1 trillion in new spending on a continuing resolution, nor are we going to be held hostage to allow illegals to get free health care in a continuing resolution. These are things that they're demanding as part of their so-called negotiation. Ladies and gentlemen, there isn't anything here to negotiate. This is a routine funding resolution to keep the government open so that we can continue our appropriations work and fund the government in the old-fashioned way, which is allowing the Appropriations Committee, Democrats and Republicans, to work together as they have been. And by the way, the Democrat leader keeps talking about not consulting. The Appropriations Committee, they picked the date. Democrats and Republicans, the big four on the Appropriations Committee, were consulting. They picked the date for the continuing resolution, November the 21st. And so this has been an open process from the very beginning. This year we opened up the appropriations process, something that wasn't done when the Democrats had the majority here in the Senate. But they have a clear choice in front of them today. And I hope there are Democrats out there. This may not represent the view of their leadership, but I'm hoping there are Democrats out there who are reasonable and understand what's at stake here. And as they have articulated many times in the past, the costs associated to the American people with the government shutdown. This is totally avoidable. It is a decision they're going to have to make, and if the government shuts down, it is on the Senate Democrats. The House has acted, the President's ready to sign the bill, and all that's left is for 8 Democrats to join us in passing that bill today. Senator Barrasso.
Well, the radical wing of the Democrat Party is demanding that Chuck Schumer shut down the government. If not, they'll be held to pay. We know that Chuck Schumer has had a war room going for the last couple of months to orchestrate the shutdown. That is their plan. So he comes up with this ransom note asking for $1 trillion to just keep the government open for 4 weeks. Republicans aren't going to buy that. President Trump's not going to sign it. There's a solution, and it's a simple, clean, continuing resolution to keep the government funded for the next 7 weeks as the appropriations committees work through the process. Democrats are pretty familiar with this. They've done it 13 times when Biden was in office, and the minimum number of votes they got was 65. But Chuck Schumer continues to bow down to that liberal wing, AOC, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren. The American people should not suffer the costs and the consequences of a Schumer shutdown because he is politically toxic in his own party.
All right, Good afternoon. Do you think if the president goes through and unilaterally starts to cut programs or lay people off, that will start to resonate with some of your Republican colleagues and say, hey, wait a minute, you know, he has that authority, but these are programs or things that are important to us. Is that a risk for Republicans?
Well, it's a risk that can be totally avoided. And if you're a Democrat who on countless occasions in the past has talked about the adverse consequences, the words of the Democrat leader, harmful, painful, chaotic consequences of a government shutdown, then just vote to keep the government open. I mean, those are things that they don't control, we don't control. How a shutdown gets managed is, at this point, a hypothetical question.
But your members aren't concerned that this might backfire, and sometimes these programs come back and they say, wait a minute, that was important to my state, that was important to my district.
Our members are unified that a government shutdown is a really bad idea for all those reasons, and it's the exact reason why Democrats ought to vote to keep the government open.
Democrats have been pretty clear. They're going to defeat this House CR when it comes to the floor today. What is Plan B? Will you keep on bringing this back to the floor? And do you think the House should reconvene before Tuesday to maybe move the ball?
I don't know what the House can do that they haven't already done. They passed the bill. It's a bill that's passed by the House, sitting here in the Senate, ready to be signed into law by the President. And so, no, it's up to the Senate Democrats. That's where we are. And if they decide to vote it down tonight, they're going to be the ones that have to explain at midnight tonight why the government is shut down. It's really pretty straightforward. And this is something, again, that's been routine around here for a long time until all of a sudden the far left, as Senator Barrasso pointed out, hijacked the Democrat leadership here in the Senate, and they've decided to hijack the American people and hold them hostage to try and get a laundry list, a wish list, a Christmas list of their left-wing priorities attached, in their case, to a 4-week continuing resolution. Ours is 7 weeks, but they'll have the same leverage 7 weeks from now that they have today. And as I've said before, we're happy to sit down with them and talk about the concerns they have, the issues they have with, for example, the premium tax credits. But you got to do that. You can't do that in the context of a hostage situation. They need to release the hostage.
If there is a shutdown.
Major crisis, no market in China, high input costs, low prices, and they are in a bind and going to need some additional help. Now, on top of that, they're facing a shutdown.
Right, and that's why we need to keep the government open. I'm just saying, the farm service agencies in my state, the Federal Highway Administration employees in my state or any of the other states, and my colleagues who are represented here, the Park Service employees in our state, these are all people that are going to be affected by this, and not to mention our military men and women, or men and women in uniform. So this is a totally avoidable crisis, and again, we are not going to be held hostage by the Democrats for more than $1 trillion in new spending, and all kinds of other items on their liberal wish list to include free health care for illegal immigrants in this country. That is all part of what can be avoided if they simply vote yes tonight.
Are you ruling out negotiations with Democrats if there's a shutdown? Are you ruling out any negotiations with Democrats if there is a shutdown?
The negotiation happens when the government's open. So let's keep the government open, and then we will have the negotiation. I've said it. I've said it yesterday at the meeting in the White House. I've said it to my Democrat colleagues. We're happy to sit down and talk about these other issues that they're interested in, but it should not have anything to do with whether or not, for a 7-week period, we keep the federal government open so that this government can continue to do its work and that we can continue to do our work through the regular appropriations process to fund the government. This is not complicated. It's something that's happened routinely around here for a long time, including the 13 times it happened when the Democrats had the majority. So it's a binary choice. They get a chance to make that vote today, and I'm hoping, I sincerely do hope, in the interest and the best interest of the American people, that the Democrats here in Washington decide to keep our federal government open. Thank you.
Your impression?
And you were just watching Republican lawmakers on Capitol Hill reiterating that if the government shuts down at 12 a.m., it is because Democrats refuse to vote for the continuing resolution. All right, taking a break. The FBI sent hundreds of agents to the U.S. Capitol and nearby locations on January 6, 2021, according to an after-action report. We discussed with the national political reporter for the Epoch Times. Don't go away. A new report reveals the amount of FBI presence at the U.S. Capitol and nearby locations on January 6, 2021. Joining us now to discuss is Nathan Wooster, national political reporter for the Epoch Times. Good afternoon to you, Nathan. So the report says over 270 FBI agents were deployed to Washington on January 6, 2021. Where exactly were they sent?
Well, they were sent to multiple locations. Some of them were sent to the Capitol itself, others to the Capitol grounds. And then there were others who were dispatched to 2 pipe bombs that were discovered outside of the headquarters of both the RNC and the DNC. And finally, there were some dispatched to a red truck where the components of Molotov cocktails were located. And this ultimately led to a 46-month sentence for a 72-year-old Army vet, Lonnie Leroy Kaufman, from Alabama, in connection with what was found in that truck.
What specific incidents did the FBI agents respond to that day? Can you talk to us about that beyond the breach of the Capitol itself?
Yes, so the discovery of those pipe bombs on January 6th was part of what I think we can describe as a fairly chaotic day. Again, you have disputes over what exactly happened at various points. Kash Patel, FBI director, has said that specifically when it comes to these FBI agents who were deployed in connection with what was happening at the Capitol, that was after the Metro Police declared a riot. And so in his words, they were thrown into something of a crowd control role.
And how many confidential human sources were documented as being in Washington on January 6th, and how many entered the Capitol?
So there were at least 26 that we know of, and this would be confidential human sources, people who were essentially, not FBI agents, but working undercover in a sense, being sources. Some of them were there in connection with domestic terror case suspects. Some of those entered the Capitol, and then others who were not also entered the Capitol. And then we had a large number who also entered the Capitol grounds. So I believe 4 total of the ones that we know about from the FBI. And then there were a number out of the 26 who also entered the Capitol grounds, were part of the chaos that we saw that day.
Can you talk to us about what are the similarities or differences between the 2024 Inspector General's findings and the after-action report?
So the IG report, it does go into detail about some things. For example, it states that there were hundreds of special agents deployed, but we didn't get a specific number as we got from this after-action report. And perhaps the most telling element of the after-action report, we have a lot of detail, raw intelligence, you might say, feedback from agents themselves, anonymous feedback on what they saw, and frankly, a lot of shortcomings that they identified with, I would say, the nature of the mission itself, and then with specific ways that it was carried out.
And Nathan, what concerns did some FBI agents express about political bias within the Bureau?
This was a consistent theme. And I should say, not all of it seemed to run in a particular direction. There was, for example, at least one comment from an anonymous agent, I believe, who said that they felt that there was an attempt that they felt to be inappropriate to act as though this was equivalent to the protests and riots that we saw in the summer of 2020. But then you had people who I think were commenting from a different perspective, really questioning whether the agency was demonstrating a capacity to be impartial in upholding the law. You had someone even stating that the basis of the republic, which is what FBI agents should be working to uphold, is in question if the transparency of elections is in question. I think this goes to not perhaps universal, but what appears based on this to have been a relatively widespread dissatisfaction with what they saw as politicization of law enforcement. Again, this is not just, say, lawmakers talking about this or commentators, but from what we can ascertain, the after-action feedback of people who were deployed in connection with January 6th from the FBI.
Can you expand on the point that some comments contrasted the FBI's handling of January 6th with its response to the 2020 protests and riots?
Yes, I think there was a sense from at least some people who were responding. And again, I should stress that there were a diversity of perspectives. Not everybody felt the same way about this, but there was a view that, at least from one comment that I can recall quite vividly, there had been a very different approach when it came to political expression that crossed that line from protests or demonstrations, free speech, into something more chaotic and violent, and that there was double standard, hypocrisy, something that I believe one commentator said that he had his issues with both what happened on January 6th and also with those protests and riots in the summer of 2020, but that the perception of a double standard was seriously undermining the FBI's mission and the perception that it has to foster to be legitimate as a neutral arbiter, as a really credible upholder of the law.
Is there anything to add about how FBI Director Kash Patel responded when details of the after-action report became public?
Well, I think it's worth emphasizing that initially, when some of these numbers were first publicized, the 274 agents, I think there may have been a perception that this only perhaps referred to the Capitol itself. And there was a question as to what were these agents doing. There was even speculation that perhaps they'd been there as agitators. But according to Director Patel, they were there in this crowd control role. And I think it's worth getting into some of the language here. It seems as though they were plainclothes, that this would be consistent with the Inspector General's report from 2024, which stated that there were no undercover agents as such. Again, we have the caveat about all of the confidential human sources. And I think the question that just about anybody who could put themselves in the shoes of people who were there might ask, were these obviously people engaged in crowd control as law enforcement, or was that less clear? And I am hoping that there will be more answers on that in the future.
Well, okay, Nathan, good to talk to you today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Don. Glad to be on.
A tale of two states. Louisiana Governor Jeff Landry calls for federal help to tackle violent crime, while Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker pushes back against federal agents. Stay tuned for that when we come back from this break. The Trump administration is moving to block Harvard University from receiving federal funding, citing alleged civil rights violations. HHS says Harvard failed to address anti-Semitic harassment on campus following last year's Hamas terror attack on Israel, violating Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. HHS has referred the university for formal administrative proceedings, which could result in the loss of funding or government-wide blocks on federal contracts. Officials say this step ensures taxpayer dollars are protected and compliance is enforced. A federal judge ruled earlier this year that the Trump administration had violated the First Amendment. The court said Harvard was already taking steps to address concerns and protect free speech rights on campus. A federal judge blocks Trump administration layoffs. A Washington court yesterday ordered a pause to the firings of hundreds of employees connected to Voice of America. District Judge Royce Lamberth halted the plan while he determines whether the Agency for Global Media complied with an injunction he issued in April. The injunction ordered it to fulfill its statutory mandate that VOA serve as a consistently reliable and authoritative source of news. The layoffs would affect more than 530 jobs for full-time staff, representing most of the agency's remaining employees. VOA broadcasts were abruptly shut down in March under an executive order from President Trump. The VOA was founded in 1942 to counter Nazi propaganda. It reached 360 million people in a week in 2024. Louisiana says it needs help. Governor Jeff Landry is asking Washington for assistance in tackling a violent crime surge across the state. NTD's Daniel Monahan reports on that, and Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker pushing back on any federal agents in his state.
Louisiana Governor Jeff Landry announced he has formally asked for federal assistance to activate up to 1,000 Louisiana National Guard members, speaking on Fox News.
Who would not want help in combating criminals on your streets? Who does not want their communities and their cities to be safe?
Landry said there were ongoing public safety concerns regarding high crime rates throughout the state. The Republican governor says police officers are overwhelmed by the number of homicides, carjackings, and gang violence.
President Trump has amassed the best cabinet of public servants and folks who really want to fight crime, like General Bondi, Secretary Noem, FBI Director Kash Patel. These folks know how to keep Americans safe.
The National Guard soldiers are expected to supplement law enforcement in high crime areas, provide logistical and communication support, and secure critical infrastructure.
The troops are happy to come. Remember, the National Guard are citizen soldiers. They are members. They are the fabric of our communities. They're our neighbors. They're our sons. They're our daughters.
In 2024, Louisiana recorded 520 violent crimes and nearly 2,300 property crimes per 100,000 residents, rates nearly 45% and 30% higher than the national averages. Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker is singing a different tune. Pritzker on Monday described Homeland Security's request for 100 troops to the state to back up ICE agents in Chicago as sowing fear, intimidation, and division among Americans. Pritzker said, quote, "With one voice, we are telling this unwarranted and unconstitutional occupation to get out of Chicago." Tensions flared last Friday outside an ICE processing facility in Broadville, Illinois. More than 200 protesters gathered near the gate in front of the facility, while dozens more crowded another entrance, chanting, "Arrest ICE, shoot ICE." Federal agents made at least 17 arrests and confiscated a gun from one rioter who was apprehended at the scene. And the Justice Department is suing Minnesota. It accuses the state and several local governments of using sanctuary policies that block immigration enforcement. Attorney General Pam Bondi says the policies defy federal law and put residents at risk. Similar lawsuits have recently been filed against New York, Los Angeles, and Boston. Bondi wrote on X Monday that the rule of law will prevail. The Attorney General says the DOJ is deploying agents to protect ICE facilities, arrest violent agitators on the spot, and bring the strongest federal charges possible. Daniel Monahan, NTD News.
The family of a man shot at a Dallas ICE facility last week says he has died. The shooting last Wednesday originally left one man dead and two other detainees critically wounded. Miguel Garcia Hernandez is now the second victim killed in last week's attack. Authorities say the gunman fired indiscriminately from a nearby rooftop. The 29-year-old then fatally shot himself after opening fire. The attack occurred amid increasing violence against immigration officers carrying out deportations. Authorities say the suspect hated the U.S. government and wanted to incite terror by killing federal agents. The devastating shooting on a church at Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints Chapel left a small Michigan community shattered. 2 days after the tragedy, investigators continue combing through the burned-out building for evidence and clues as to what led to the assault. Here are the details on the investigation and the attacker.
Evil. This was an evil act of violence. That's exactly what this was.
The investigation into the deadly attack that killed 4 people and left 8 others injured at the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Grand Blanc Township, Michigan continues, with police saying everyone has been accounted for. Authorities confirm that improvised explosive devices were found at the scene by a bomb squad after discovering a suspicious item on church property. The attack started just after 10 Sunday morning. Investigators say the gunman rammed his pickup truck into the front door of the church, then began shooting at worshipers with an assault rifle before setting the building on fire. Police say the 40-year-old gunman, Thomas Jacob Sanford, an Iraq War veteran, died in a shootout with police 8 minutes after the first emergency call. And investigators say he had been arrested in the past. for burglary and OWI or operating a vehicle while intoxicated. While the motive remains under investigation, the White House says the attack appeared to be motivated by religious hatred.
Based on my conversations with the FBI director, all they know right now is this was an individual who hated people of the Mormon faith.
A city council candidate, Chris Johns, says he spoke to Sanford just days before the attack while campaigning in his neighborhood.
He asked me about, what do you think about guns? And after that, it really took a very sharp turn into, he goes, the next question was, what do you know about Mormons?
President Trump says he's giving Hamas terrorists only a few days to accept his Gaza peace plan. That's the 20-point plan he announced yesterday to end the fighting in the enclave.
We're going to do about 3 or 4 days. We'll see how it is. All of the Arab countries are signed up. The Muslim countries all signed up. Israel's all signed up. We're just waiting for Hamas, and Hamas is either going to be doing it or not, and if it's not, it's going to be a very sad end.
Trump added that the main points for Hamas are to give back all remaining hostages and to stop the fighting, but the president warned that if Hamas doesn't agree, then the U.S. will let Israel continue its military campaign in Gaza. Israel has long said it wants to completely eradicate Hamas. Trump said that Israel's military killed 25,000 Hamas fighters since the October 7th attacks. The president also highlighted that Hamas leadership has been eliminated 3 times since then. Eric Trump has unveiled the future location of his father's presidential library. He shared on X that in a unanimous vote, the Florida cabinet approved the land conveyance in Miami. Governor Ron DeSantis said the state is donating the property for the library, which he said would be good for Miami and Florida. The 2.5-acre property has waterfront views. It is currently being used as an employee parking lot at Miami-Dade College. A real estate consultant told the New York Times the lot has an appraised value of about $66 million, but could sell for 5 times that. In Eric Trump's post, he added that this will be one of the most beautiful buildings ever built, an icon on the Miami skyline. A German court has issued its verdict in a major Chinese espionage case. The suspect, a former aide to a German politician, was found guilty of leaking data to the Chinese Communist Party for nearly 20 years. NTD international correspondent David Vivez has the details.
The verdict has been handed down: nearly 5 years in prison in the largest case of Chinese espionage in Germany to date. After a 13-day trial, it has been proven that a German national born Chinese known as Jiang Jie was an employee of the Chinese intelligence service. Jiang Jie worked as an aide for German politician Maximilian Krah from the AfD, or Alternative to Germany Party, and has been convicted of leaking more than 500 sensitive EU and party documents to China, as well as compiling the personal data of more than 25,000 Chinese dissidents in Europe. Due to at least 20 years of activity as an agent, as well as systematic spying on the EU, Germany, the AfD, and politically persecuted opposition figures, the Federal Prosecutor's Office considers Jay's case to be particularly serious.
This has been the most serious case of Chinese espionage in Germany to date. The court found that the defendant had been working for the Chinese Secret Service in the Federal Republic of Germany for almost 20 years and had become extensively involved in Chinese intelligence efforts here in Germany.
In this role, Jay focused primarily on spying on and blackmailing prominent Chinese opposition figures, with severe consequences for those affected, their families, and the Chinese opposition. The Epoch Times reports that in an intercepted conversation with a Chinese intelligence officer, the discussion is said to have included a January 2024 EU Parliament resolution against spiritual practice Falun Gong, which is persecuted in China. The co-defendant, known as Yat X, has been sentenced to 1 year and 9 months.
Finally, together with his co-defendant, Ms. X, he collected information about transports and flights departing from Halle Leipzig Airport, in particular those involving military transport, and he also collected and passed on information about individuals working in the arms industry.
The Dresden Public Prosecutor's Office is also investigating Jay's employer, Maximilian Krah, in separate proceedings. Allegations of money laundering and bribery as an elected EU Parliament representative remain pending. David Vives, NTD News, Paris.
Charlie Kirk's organization Turning Point USA is returning to Utah today for its college tour. This will be the first event in the state since the co-founder was assassinated at Utah Valley University. The event will take place at Utah State University, which is about 120 miles north of where Kirk was killed. The event will feature conservative podcast host Alex Clark and a panel with Senator Mike Lee, Representative Andy Biggs, former Representative Jason Chaffetz, and Governor Spencer Cox. Since Kirk's murder, the youth organization has seen a surge in interest across the nation. There have been tens of thousands of requests to launch new chapters at high schools and colleges. Turning Point USA is now overseen by Kirk's widow, Erica, and Kirk's former aides and friends. Joining us now to discuss President Trump's new actions to clamp down on Antifa and other domestic terrorist groups is Mark Trammell, CEO at the Center for American Liberty and an attorney. Good afternoon, Mark. How are you doing today?
I'm well. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you, Mark. So how much of an impact do you think this will have in rooting out political violence? This, all of government effort against domestic political violence, and it calls for coordination, as you already know, among the DOJ, DHS, the Treasury, and state and local agencies.
Yeah, so I think this is, not just a good executive order. I think this is a great executive order. Through our work at the Center for American Liberty, we've been representing a journalist named Andy Ngo for years because of Antifa violence. Antifa, years ago, brutally assaulted Andy not once but twice in the streets of Portland, leaving him with brain hemorrhages. And while the elected officials in Portland did nothing to defend Andy as a victim or to advocate for him as a victim of this crime, it left the Center for American Liberty to file this lawsuit seeking financial damages. So I would applaud the president for doing this, because what he's doing is he's doing exactly what he was elected to do, right? He's protecting the physical safety of the American people and the liberties that are promised through the Constitution. It's unfortunate that local officials are abdicating their duties, but I'm very grateful that this president is stepping in to protect the American people.
So you mentioned you're representing Andy Ngo, right? In light of that, can you talk to us about how does Antifa keep evading accountability?
Yeah, I think this is kind of a multifaceted process, right? So there's really not arrests taking place, and I don't blame law enforcement for that phenomenon. In places like Portland, prosecutors, these are elected positions generally across the country, prosecutors refuse to prosecute Antifa for their lawless crimes. And when mayors and other elected officials are marching in the streets with members of Antifa, law enforcement has really no incentive to put their lives at risk to stop these violent terrorist thugs in the streets. If they're going to risk their lives to arrest someone, only to have prosecutors null pros the case, why take that risk, right? And so here, now that federal agencies are going to get involved, that they'll investigate, that they'll dismantle illegal operations, these terrorist operations by Antifa, the result is going to be a much safer America.
So under current U.S. law, how is domestic terrorism defined? How does that work when President Trump is designating Antifa as a domestic terrorist organization?
Yeah, well, I think what's key here is that it's providing leadership and instruction to agencies that you just mentioned, right? To the FBI, to the DOJ, to be involved really on a more localized level in protecting the rights and the liberties of the American people. I think if law enforcement agents in these local communities, right, if prosecutors in Portland were doing their job, then the president wouldn't have to take this act to protect the American people. But they've abdicated their duties, and they've left the president with quite a mess to clean up. So we're very grateful at the Center for American Liberty that the president is doing this. Just this morning, I saw on social media images again of Antifa chasing down journalists in the streets of Portland. And so I think, there's a huge story here in what the president is doing to protect the American people. There's a huge story that's not being talked about, and it's ironic, right? It's that the media, legacy media organizations are ignoring this, and in some cases, when they do cover it, they're actually criticizing President Trump for taking these actions. It's very ironic. The actions that he is taking are actually protecting their First Amendment rights as journalists. Something that Antifa, if you report negatively of Antifa, you become a target. Look at the streets of Portland. The graffiti with Andy Ngo's name on it, it's everywhere.
And you're right, some have criticized President Trump for doing this. Some are arguing that Antifa is closer to, a leaderless movement than an organized terrorist group. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, Antifa is certainly an ideology. I think President Biden described Antifa as an ideology, but it's not merely an ideology. It's an ideology with legs, right? And it's it's a radical terrorist ideology that's being inflicted in streets across the country. And so, again, this is a very, very good act of leadership from the White House. And the result is going to be the American people being much safer. We're seeing what the president's leadership is doing in the city of Washington. And we're it looks like about to see that play out in other cities across the country.
This is something interesting that I've pondered about. Can you comment on this? Does the First Amendment have protections for free association, even with Antifa?
So the First Amendment absolutely protects the right of association, right? That's certainly encompassed in it. I think what's important to remember is that this executive order does not infringe upon your right of association. It does not infringe upon Antifa's ability to protest peacefully in the streets. The executive order expressly is targeted toward criminal activity. It actually says illegal operations. It's the operative language from the executive order. So I think the White House was very careful in drafting this executive order so that it wouldn't be applied as a suppression of protected First Amendment activity, but rather as a law enforcement mechanism to give the federal agencies involved the resources that they need to keep the American people safe, and to do so in a constitutionally respectful manner.
So as we already know, on the bullet casings that were fired against Charlie Kirk, there were anti-fascist messages on them, right? How can Americans and government push back against radical ideologies in today's digital environment?
Yeah, I think the answer is more speech. I think when we self-censor, it gives organizations and ideologies like Antifa a tremendous amount of power. But if we continue to call out Antifa for what it is, and it itself is a fascist organization that uses force and threats of force to intimidate the American people, to suppress the exercising of First Amendment rights, when we continue to call it out for what it is, it actually gives the American people a tremendous amount of power, and it pushes back against the self-censorship that Antifa wants. So I think here the solution, just from our perspective, right? What can just an average American, what can we do? It's to continue to talk. It's to continue to engage in dialogue, to be honest about it, what Antifa is actually doing. I think the answer is more speech.
Yeah, very well said today, Mark. Thank you so much for giving us your time.
Thanks again.